Britain spent £1.25 billion on 5 frigates, which works out to £250 million each. A single American Arleigh Burke destroyer cost somewhere north of $2 billion, which meant the Royal Navy's new ship cost, per unit, roughly what the United States Navy spends on a moderately complicated Tuesday. Everyone noticed, and almost everyone drew the same conclusion, that Britain had simply given up. The country that invented the modern warship had looked at its bank account, looked at its ambitions, and quietly decided to reconcile the two by building something that was, at best, a credible-looking frigate-shaped object. The press called it a budget frigate. Defense analysts questioned whether it could survive a real engagement, and some asked, not entirely unkindly, whether the Royal Navy had confused a frigate with a large patrol vessel. Here is the thing about that conclusion. It was wrong. Not slightly wrong, not debatably wrong, but comprehensively, embarrassingly, historically wrong. On the 13th of August, 2026, a warship named ORP Wicher entered the waters of the Gulf of Gdansk in a manner befitting her unconventional origins. Rather than sliding down a slipway in the traditional fashion, a semi-submersible barge was gradually submerged beneath her hull until she became buoyant, and tugs pulled her clear into open water. ORP Wicher is not a British ship. She is Polish, built at the PGZ Naval Shipyard in Gdynia, and she is constructed on the same design that the defense community spent years dismissing. Poland didn't simply purchase a license and leave the building to someone else. Poland is constructing 3 of these ships at a program cost of approximately 15 billion Polish zloty, which translates to around 3.8 billion US dollars. Indonesia has 2 under construction right now, with licenses signed in January 2026, covering 2 more. And Britain, the country that originated the design and absorbed the mockery for being too economical to do it properly, is now watching foreign customers order more capable, more heavily armed, and more expensive versions of its own ship than Britain ever chose to build for itself. That is the story, and it begins with a problem that, back in 1919, had no clean solution in sight. The Royal Navy in the late 2010s confronted a challenge without a satisfying answer. Its Type 23 frigates had been entering service since the early 1990s and were aging out of usefulness, and the replacement program, the Type 26, represented the serious solution. A world-class anti-submarine warfare frigate, heavily armed, exquisitely capable, and expensive enough that Britain could only justify building 8 of them. 8 ships, for a navy that once patrolled every ocean on Earth. 8 wasn't enough, and everyone in the program knew it. The Navy needed a second class to cover the numbers gap, something that could show the flag, escort convoys, patrol contested waters, and demonstrate in concrete terms that Britain still maintained a surface fleet worth acknowledging. The requirement came with an explicit cost ceiling of £250 million per ship on average, and the message behind that ceiling was unambiguous. Don't give us something aspirational, give us something we can actually afford to build 5 of. What came back from industry was Babcock's Arrowhead 140, and the reaction in certain corners of the defense community was, to put it charitably, skeptical. The criticism wasn't entirely without foundation. At its initial specification, the Type 31 carried a lighter armament than many contemporary frigates, which prompted questions about whether it held enough anti-ship missiles, enough sensors, enough of the systems that determine whether a warship survives an engagement. One analysis described it at the time as more of a presence ship than a warfighter, the implication being that it belonged in peacetime patrols rather than peer competition. But here's the thing the critics chose not to engage with, where the design actually came from. Babcock hadn't invented the Arrowhead 140 from nothing. The hull lineage traces directly to the Danish Iver Huitfeldt class, developed by Odense Maritime Technology between 2005 and 2007, and the Iver Huitfeldt is not a budget ship by any measure. It ranks among the most capable and cost-effective frigates constructed anywhere in Europe over the past 2 decades. What Babcock produced was a proven, combat-credible hull adapted to British requirements and British pricing constraints, and the architecture underneath all the controversy was genuinely solid. Babcock signed the contract in November 2019, covering 5 ships at £1.25 billion total: HMS Venturer, HMS Active, HMS Formidable, HMS Bulldog, and HMS Campbelltown. Construction started at Rosyth in Scotland, which carried weight beyond the military dimension, since this represented work for British workers, British supply chains, and British steel, with the Ministry of Defence citing approximately 2,500 jobs supported across the program. And then, quietly, the export conversations began. The export version of the Arrowhead 140 is not the same ship as the British version, and the gap between the two is where the story becomes genuinely interesting. Poland's Miecznik program, which translates roughly as swordfish, specified a frigate carrying serious anti-air and anti-submarine capability, with a weapons fit substantially heavier than the Royal Navy's own Type 31. Indonesia's Merah Putih frigates, constructed at the PT PAL shipyard in Surabaya, carry Turkish combat systems, which produces a situation that no procurement document could have predicted. An Indonesian warship, built on a Danish lineage hull, designed by a British company and armed with Turkish weapons. Put numbers on it, and the gap is stark. The Indonesian ships are planned around a 64-cell vertical launch system amidships. The Polish ships carry a bow thruster and space for a hull-mounted sonar that the British ships simply don't have. And the Royal Navy's version, even after this summer's upgrade decision, is expected to sail with somewhere around a dozen strike-length cells. Same hull, very different ship. The Arrowhead 140 had evolved from a specific ship into something closer to a platform architecture, a proven and adaptable structure that different navies fill differently according to their own threat environments and strategic priorities. Britain's own ships are catching up. The June 2026 UK Defence Investment Plan confirmed the Type 31 will carry the Naval Strike Missile, addressing what had been the most widely cited gap in the original equipment specification. HMS Venturer was launched in June 2025, with HMS Active following in March 2026, and both are progressing towards service entry. They are not yet in service, which is worth holding in mind given that two foreign-built derivatives of their design are already afloat, one in Indonesia since December, and one floated out of a Polish shipyard earlier this month. There is something almost perfectly calibrated about that sequence of events. Britain designed the ship, received considerable criticism for designing it, and is now watching Poland and Indonesia put water under hulls built on a design that Britain itself hasn't finished delivering yet. Babcock has also disclosed losses from the domestic program, having set aside around £140 million associated with design changes and rework on the first two British ships. The export market, as it turns out, may prove considerably more comfortable financially than the home one, which is not the outcome anyone predicted when the contract was signed. So why did the export campaign succeed when the domestic reception was so cold? Part of the answer is timing, and part of it is the security environment that reshaped European defense priorities after February 2022. Countries that had been comfortable with minimal naval investment suddenly weren't, and Poland sits at the front of that category. Poland's combined defense budget reached approximately 4.8% of GDP in 2026, merging the Ministry of National Defense allocation with the Armed Forces Support Fund, and that figure doesn't represent a country treating maritime defense as a secondary concern. It represents a country that has examined its geography, assessed its neighborhood, and concluded the answer to both involves more ships, built more quickly. The Arrowhead 140 offered newly serious customers something they genuinely needed: a proven design that could be constructed in reasonable timeframes, adapted to national specifications, and transferred meaningfully to domestic industry. The Miecznik frigates aren't being assembled at a British yard, they're being built at PGZ Stocznia Wojenna in Gdynia, with Polish workers and Polish industrial capacity, which meant buying the Arrowhead 140 wasn't simply acquiring a frigate. It was acquiring a shipbuilding capability, and for a country investing at Poland's current rate, that distinction matters enormously. The program has stayed on its schedule, which is not a sentence that features prominently in most discussions of European naval procurement. The budget is another matter. The contract signed in 2021 has roughly doubled through successive amendments to its current 15 billion zloty. But the ships are being built to the timeline, and for a shipyard that was in bankruptcy a decade ago, that alone tells you something about how the program has been managed. Consider what the launch of ORP Wicher represents in concrete human terms. Poland's Navy has operated aging vessels for decades, and across the Royal Navy's own fleet, 8 Type 23 frigates had already been retired between 2021 and 2026, leaving just 5 of that class still in commission. 5 aging frigates for a country with North Atlantic responsibilities, global commitments, and an island geography that makes maritime power something other than an optional extra. 5 is a number that focuses the mind, and it explains precisely why the Type 31 program existed in the first place. The Type 31 was always the answer to that arithmetic. Not a glamorous answer, not the kind that generates enthusiastic briefing slides at arms exhibitions, but 5 ships that exist are more useful than a more capable ship still working through its procurement pipeline. A 250 million pound frigate that can be built, crewed, and deployed addresses the numbers problem in a way that nothing more expensive could, given the budget available. What the critics described as a compromise, customers recognized as a solution, and the export record is now the clearest possible evidence of that gap in interpretation. The Arrowhead 140 is not the ceiling of what the design can achieve. It is the floor, the baseline from which every customer builds upward according to their own requirements. Indonesia's ships will carry different systems than Poland's ships, which carry different systems than Britain's ships, yet all of them share the same hull family, the same fundamental architecture, and the same proven lineage from those Danish frigates that Odense Maritime Technology drew up 2 decades ago. And there is one additional detail worth sitting with. Denmark, the country whose Everhuitfeldt frigates provided the genetic starting point for the entire Arrowhead 140 lineage, is currently evaluating whether to order the design for its own navy. A Danish order would bring the whole arc full circle in a way that almost feels like it was planned from the beginning. It wasn't, and that's precisely what makes it worth mentioning. ORP Wicher will begin sea trials in the first half of 2029, with handover to the Polish Navy scheduled before the end of that year. Her sisters, ORP Berza and ORP Hurricane, are expected to follow by the end of 2031. In Indonesia, KRI Balaputradewa entered the water in December 2025, with the second Indonesian ship already under construction, and the 2 additional licenses from January 2026 suggest the Indonesian fleet will grow further still. Back in Britain, HMS Venturer and her 4 sisters are progressing toward handover by, in the Ministry of Defense's carefully chosen phrasing, the end of the 2020s, which is technically a timeline if you're prepared to be generous about what that phrase encompasses. The ship that Britain was quietly embarrassed to be building became the design that multiple allied navies are now building instead, more of them, faster, and in several cases better armed. The budget frigate turned out to be one of the most successful British naval export designs in a generation, and the laughter that greeted its announcement in 2019 had grown noticeably quieter somewhere between the Polish contract signing and the Indonesian keel-laying ceremony. Denmark's decision on the Arrowhead 140 is expected in the coming months, and when that result lands, it will be covered here. If the pattern you've just watched, where a program gets dismissed, then quietly proves its worth through the decisions of other nations, is the kind of thing that interests you, this channel tracks exactly that territory. ORP Wicher is in the water, the program is expanding, and the story isn't finished yet.